Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So in order to fight the depression, and depressions have to be fought, you don't capitulate to depressions in the Austrian manner. We're not liquidationists here in the tradition of Andrew Mellon, Heinrich Brüning, and others. You got to fight depression. So you fight the depression by building an ultra-modern, super-speed, north-south Pacific maglev from San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, on to Portland and Seattle. This is a permanent addition to the capital stock of that part of the U.S. and a permanent enhancement to the productivity of labor, meaning look at all those saved man-hours and look at the speed you can get by using the maglev for freight. Freight, obviously, a big consideration. So these are the choices you have to make. The Chinese and the Japanese are moving ahead. The Germans know how to make these things. And the U.S. is nowhere, as usual, falling behind into decadence and despair. So it's time to get these things out and build them. Reconvert auto plants as a part of the strategy. And finally, again, if the bankers and politicians are really so ideological and so insane that they can't do any of these things, then it's time to agitate for a general debt moratorium, a permanent freeze on all bonded debt. You default. States can default. It's happened before. It'll happen again. Not the end of the world. And if the bankers don't want that, then let them be reasonable and call off their lobbying myrmidons from Sacramento, from Washington, D.C., and elsewhere. If they insist on sabotaging every rational and reasonable solution to the crisis, then they're going to get the worst. The Latin Americans have done this before, right, when the Argentinians declared a debt moratorium with Rodriguez Sá back in 2000, 2001. Then under Kirchner, Argentina fared much better as a result of that debt moratorium because it put the bankers on the spot. And when you're a big debtor, you acquire leverage over the lender, and California certainly qualifies. And, of course, what are you going to do in general? It's time for struggle. It's time for general strike, mass strike, wildcat strikes, other kinds of actions to fight back against austerity. If you have militant unions, if you have nurses, public employees, teachers, and others, they've got to be warned that if you don't fight now, if you sit around like certain Germans in 1933, waiting for somebody's order to go out and demonstrate, it may be too late. So it's time for struggle. It's high time for struggle around a program like this. The big thing is to know what to demand. All kinds of labor ferment. The London subway, the underground, is shut down right now. Do those guys know what to demand? I haven't looked into their demands, but it's very often the case that you get really militant struggles going on, and the demands don't get you anywhere, and therefore the strike does not spread, does not get you support from the unemployed and the underemployed and from the public in general, and therefore with the ruling elite controlling the mass media, then you're isolated, you're surrounded, and then your agitation is crushed. So don't fall for any of that. Draft emergency action program for California. And again, that Tobin tax, that securities transfer tax, who should pay for the crisis? The bankers, the hedge fund people, and the rest of them should pay for the crisis. And we want a progressive outcome, building the Pacific maglev that would then allow the U.S. to leapfrog over these other countries and turn the tremendous backwardness now in the U.S. into an advantage by going from the technology of the 19th century to the technology of the 21st century. Now, sticking with economics for a minute, we've talked about the payback of the TARP by some of these banks. Of course, the $12 trillion to the Fed is largely out there. There are also about $5 or $6 billion of warrants, that is the ability to buy shares of stock, which these banks are trying to get back from the Treasury. So don't believe it if people say, well, now the banks are off the hook. They are not. The thank you from these same banks and hedge funds is to have now driven the price of oil up to above $75 a barrel, and we'll check the actual price here momentarily, but it's above $75 a barrel, and that, of course, is all pure speculation. Everybody knows it. It has nothing to do with supply and demand. Demand is depressed because of the depression, and therefore this is a complete fraud. The only way to deal with that is government action, re-regulation, position limits, 100% margin requirements, and a systematic distinction between the speculator on the one hand and the user, end user, and or hedger on the other. Here's an interesting statistic. The lifeblood of the world economy is world trade. Now, you go to the WTO, of all people, the World Trade Organization. They have statistics. They just had on May 18th to 19th, they had data day in the United Nations International Bureaucracy. How interesting. What we find here is that world trade, understood as total world exports, this is how they measure it, peaked at a level of about 180 on their index between the second quarter and the third quarter of 2008. That is to say, if the first quarter of 2005 was 100, we got up to 180 in world trade on their index between the second and third quarters of last year, 2008. But then a very, very sharp decline set in, the biggest drop since World War II, and the result is, you look at their graph, you've got a fall of about 35 to 40% as of the first quarter of 2009. So January, February, March of 2009, we have a 35 to 40% decline of world trade total, merchandise exports worldwide in current U.S. dollars. Now, that obviously better to use physical units, but this is what we have. We have current U.S. dollars. So therefore, a breathtaking, shocking, stunning contraction of world trade just between the second and third quarters of 2008, when the peak was reached, and then the first quarter of 2009. The official statistic, they say, is the first quarter of 2009 compared to the first quarter of 2008 is down 31%. But, of course, that doesn't give you the full magnitude of the fall. I'm convinced that the actual fall is in the neighborhood of 40% as of the end of the first quarter. Now, what else do we know? After that, Germany, the biggest exporter in Europe, and probably in many ways the most export-dependent country in the world, and therefore the best barometer for the world economic situation. German exports down 30% in the month of April. So that's now after the first quarter that we've been talking about here with WTO. German exports down almost one-third in the month of April of 2009. The contraction of world trade is the most ominous, the most generalized symptom of a world economic depression of incalculable proportions. A killer depression is coming in. Don't believe the nonsense on Bubble Vision there, CNBC or Fox Business News or whatever Bubble Vision you may watch. The world economy continues to contract massively. Unemployment is growing. We have Barkey, right, with his dazzling smile, right? Barkey, the telegenic demagogue, says that he's creating or saving or creating 600,000 jobs. Well, it's down. It's about 500,000 jobs lost per month. And how you calculate saved jobs? This, of course, is anybody's guess. This is like mark to model. You can make that say anything you want. And, of course, Barkey now says it's time for pay-go. Yeah, in other words, in his view, after Wall Street got everything they wanted, and that's all been dished out, now it's time for austerity for you, the little guy. And therefore he's coming after your health care with rationing, and he's coming after you with cap-and-trade super tax to please Al Gore and Prince Charles and other titled oligarchs and wealthy elitists. We'll be back in a minute here on World Crisis Radio.